Any questions? Comments?
What are some good sources to find in English some of these stories?
Well, the Scottish stories, actually, if you can look up the Popular Tales of the West Highlands, right? John Francis Campbell was collected in the mid-19th century at the time when this tradition was really dying in Gaelic Scotland, but that's sort of painstakingly recorded.
What was the title of that again?
Popular Tales of the West Highlands. And that's, some of them are both in Gaelic and English, so you can actually compare the way it's translated. In Irish, there's an enormous amount. I mean, you can look up in Bealagis, which is the Irish folklore journal. I mean, some of the articles are in Irish, but most of them are in English. You'll find careful studies of comparisons of these stories and different techniques for telling them and putting them in context. A problem with a lot of the folktale collections that you find, Irish folk tales like Yeats collected and so forth, is that you don't have the context. He tells the story as a literary story, and you don't get the sense that it's being told to a particular audience. The ones that are more carefully collected by folklorists will give you the comments of the storyteller as he introduces it to the audience, and will give the conclusion of the storyteller. That's often left out. You don't have the sense of him actually talking to anyone except to the reader.
Could I just say that I know that Popular Tales of the West Highlands and really all these stories are on the internet on sites
That's
like
right, yeah.
Sacred Texts and Ancient
That's
Texts,
right.
and they'll go and they'll have them, Welsh tales, Scottish tales,
Right.
Manx tales, whatever. So.
Yeah.
So Google.
I was a bit confused, and I don't know why. The source of Fenian, now there was a person first? I mean, does it come from a person?
Well, Fenian, it's anglicization of Fian. Fian is a warrior band. And you talk about Fenian tales, meaning tales that have to do with these warrior bands.
Okay, so it's a special kind of warrior, but it's the warrior band and not somebody who started it.
It's not a person, no. But Finn, right, Finn McCool is a Fenian.
Okay.
So stories about Fenians usually involve Finn McCool.
So he was a special one for the storytellers.
Right.
Okay.
He was a special subject for storytellers. That is, most of the stories about the Fianna center around him. They have him as a character somewhere. He's very much like King Arthur in a way. A lot of Arthurian stories are very much like Fenian stories, except that King Arthur originally was not a king in a court somewhere. He was a guerrilla leader, and his followers were sort of fighting in the forest and living the same kind of life as the Fenians did. So there are a lot of thematic similarities between Arthurian stories, especially as they're told in Brythonic Celtic languages, and Fenian stories from Ireland and Scotland.
I've heard the term often, but I've never really gotten it together.
Yeah. In the 19th century, people got a strange idea about them. Because they were warriors, they thought that they were basically soldiers defending Ireland. And so that's how it became a political term, where you had the Fenians, who were basically Irish revolutionaries fighting against the British government. But that's not at all what the Fenians are in mythological tradition. They don't have that role at all. They're certainly not patriots. They're mercenaries. I mean, that's how they make their living, is that they're not tied down to a particular land or political entity. They're independent of all that.
With all their supernatural abilities.
Yes, they're independent of that. They're close to the land, and the land is unpolitical. The land is just the land.
Is there any tradition at all or evidence that, let's say if someone is telling the stories, would they finish the story? Or is there any evidence that they would say, all right, tomorrow night we'll do more?
Yes, definitely. In fact, you have
they leave them cliffhanging.
Yes, no, certainly. So the Eamon Burke had a gigantic story. I think that's the longest story we've ever recorded from folk tradition. It's called Ocher MacGreen and Ocher, the son of a king in Ireland. And that takes forever to tell. I mean, you have to do it in several sittings. And this was not unusual in the older days. In Wales, as a matter of fact, the people who made the Arthurian legend popular in the rest of Europe, Cyfarwyddiaid, people who Kavarwydd is someone is putting together of symbols, putting together of images, and that's the craft of the storyteller. And the Mabinogion, of course, the Mabinogion tales come out of that tradition. And you know, the Mabinogi, right, the main story in there is in 4 branches. And the 4 branches are there because you can't tell the story in one sitting, you have to tell it in 4 sittings. So there's sort of a transition between each one of the branches. Say more next time, you know.
Keep them coming back to the hearth on those cold Celtic nights.
If these storytellers were men, was this their job? Were they paid for it?
No.
Or if they would go into the homes, would they...
No, they were paid for it in the sense that they would get gifts.
I don't want to say take it out and trade, but I mean, like in exchange for food.
Yes, yes.
So
they would certainly...
way.
You see, it was a blessing on the community. It was a literal blessing to have a story told. You know, a blessing on anyone who hears this story. It was a religious function. And so,
But they
yes,
wouldn't do it outside.
no, they wouldn't do it elsewhere. They wouldn't do it
outside.
Outside in the cold, no.
Yeah.
They would do it in someone's house or in the storyteller's house. But usually, you know, someone would be the host and would have everybody come over to listen to a particular story, and they would feed them, and they would give something special as a gift to the storyteller, definitely. That is, because of his function, he would receive material goods that were necessary for him.
Would this be his, I don't want to say profession exactly, but would this be his job? Or would he be
It would be one of his jobs. He would be doing something else
in the
as well.
summer?
Yes, he would be
Farming,
doing something else,
whatever.
usually, yeah, definitely. That said, there were women. One of the greatest Breton storytellers was the woman Marguerite Philippe, who's one of Luzel, Franchenuel, or François Luzel, as he's called in French, was the greatest collector of Breton folklore in the 19th century. He very painstakingly took down the recitals of, again, these kinds of sacred storytellers in Brittany that was still around at the time, and one of his informants was Marguerite Philippe, who had some of the greatest sort of large-scale versions of the mythological stories, and she was a woman. In Brittany it seemed to have been less unusual for women to do this, for some reason.
Thank you for a very enjoyable
Yeah.
time.
Oh, well, thank you.
Good.
It lasted into the 20th century in Scotland. In fact, we have very good recordings of that, in which the same stories are told, but in strict verse, and they're usually chanted. That is, they're not sung the way a ballad would be sung to a song, to a tune that you recognize, but just on certain pitches, instead of chanted in a kind of like a church chant almost. And it continued it was obviously still in Ireland in the 19th century. Probably a lot of it disappeared at the time of the famine. And there were still some people in Donegal who knew how to do it around the 1940s. And there's some recordings of those. But otherwise, everything we know is from Scotland. And in Scotland, again, there was a tradition of doing it in the dark of the year, and people would often do it as a kind of trick-or-treating thing. They would be reciting these, we could call them ballads, although they're not, they're narrative poems that are chanted, and they would go from house to house, and they would get gifts for doing this. Again, because there was a blessing to have these songs performed.
Sort of like wassailing.
Yes, it's very similar, except in this case the ritual element is more obvious. Yeah, wassailing, essentially you drink to the health of the people, and that's the blessing that you give them. Whereas there you're reciting the stories of the Fenians, essentially, because you're doing it in verse, chanting, and it's the same kind of blessing as if the storyteller were telling it to you.
I noticed one of the books you have there is in Gaelic. The whole book
Yeah,
is in Gaelic.
the whole book is, yeah.
Oh, can I just look at what the letters look like?
Sure.
Like accent over some of the letters.
Yeah, the red ones. It has some Gaelic in it.
Wow. So you can read this and understand it?
Yes, sure. Well, I teach
you,
it.
you teach it?
Yes.
Oh wow. How did you learn to?
I lived on the Aran Islands in the 60s.
Oh really? So you learn from the people by living among
Absolutely,
them?
yeah. No, I never
Wow.
took an Irish class in my life, actually.
Sorry.
Except
Wow.
Old
You
Irish.
lived where?
In the Outer Islands, off the west coast of Ireland.
Wow. That's interesting.
Sure.
The accent over the letter, does that make the letter more
It makes it
stronger,
long.
pronounced longer?
It's a long vowel.
So it's even?
Emen. Emen de boer. Steelte.
Oh.
Shanaki? Shanaki? How did you?
Shanachie.
I'm scared to turn it off.
Shanachie.
Alexei, I'm scared to turn it off again, and you immediately start saying something else interesting.